It's time we are starting. Nine. Well,
Sainath, your lighting also to be improved, please.
Meeting is now
lighting, yes. Let's all look bright, yeah.
The meeting is now streaming
like
on
Dinesh.
YouTube, live.
Yes, your T-shirt is prominent.
All right, it's time. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At the eve of Air Force Day, we are hosting this event. We are on behalf of Colors of Glory Foundation and the Peninsula Foundation. A warm welcome to all of you. We have a very eminent Air Force veteran whom we all know of, most of us. We are honored to have him delivering the talk today. For the purpose of formality, I'll read out his resume. Air Marshal Matheswaran is an Indian Air Force veteran of 39 years service. Air Marshal M. Matheswaran is an outstanding fighter pilot who has been an experimental test pilot with the Aircraft and Systems Testing Establishment and a fighter combat leader of the Tactics and Air Combat Development Establishment. By virtue of holding significant command and staff appointments, he gathered extensive experience in defense strategy, research and development, space strategy, and electronics and information warfare. Before retiring while being the Deputy Chief of Integrated Defense Staff. Somebody is not muted, please mute. Responsible for policy, plans, and force development. The President of India has honored him by the awards of Adi Vishishta Seva Medal and Vayu Sena Medal. A soldier scholar, he holds a PhD in Defense and Strategy Studies from the University of Madras, a postgraduate diploma in Finance Management, and a senior fellowship in International and National Security from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Governance. He is an alumnus of the National Defense College, New Delhi. The Air Marshal is the founder president of the Peninsula Foundation, who is co-hosting this event with us, a Chennai-based non-profit, non-partisan public policy research think tank. He is also a strategic consultant for aerospace and defense industries. Mr. Air Marshal, for you, ladies and gentlemen, over to you, Air Marshal.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the kind introduction. Let me share a few slides. Okay. Can I do that? Okay. Can you all see it?
Yes, I can see.
Okay. How do I can get it onto the full screen? How do I get to the full screen?
Yeah, you can do the slideshow on the right bottom. You have the slideshow.
Is it okay now?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, good evening to everybody. And on the occasion of the Indian Air Force's 89th, it finishes 88 years, and 89th Air Force Founders Day on October 8th. On this occasion, let me wish all air veterans and all our colleagues very happy Air Force Day in advance. I will not go into details of everyone's experience and everybody knows about the Indian Air Force. I'll just touch upon certain critical issues. As the topic indicates, that we believe the Indian government and the Indian strategy must focus on using the air power as the foremost instrument in its military strategy and diplomacy in the 21st century. And I'll argue why it needs to be so. Well, the Indian Air Force is one of the oldest air forces in the world. How do I this? One sec. Yeah. Came into existence on 1st October 1932. One of the oldest air forces in the world, and has touched the sky with glory, with immense, fabulous performances. in the World War II in Burma campaign. But before that, it just came into existence as a very small fledgling force in 1932 to deal with the frontier provinces in the northwest and as pioneer squadrons and coastal defense squadrons. As the World War II dawned, quickly, the things changed and it became a full-fledged air force in a matter of just 3 years. And you will see, I think I covered that in a lecture on Madras and its, linkage with the Air Force. The number of airfields that were built first in the south and then across the country and more into the central regions and into northeast. The number of airfields that dotted the country, and today most of them are abandoned. I think quite a lot of them are being revived, is phenomenal. So the Allied Air Forces operated from here. The Indian Air Force operated tremendously in the Royal Indian Air Force in the Burma campaign. And I think that's a history that needs to also get opened out in a big way through research, and a lot of issues will come out of that. I did visit, the Nagaland Cemetery, a couple of years ago, and visited a lot of, World War II related locations with some of the friends. And it's actually quite revealing to actually get back and open up that campaign and study that. One of the British historians, in fact, the British government officially has gone ahead and acknowledged the Burma campaign as the most or the toughest campaign in the Second World War. Now, finally. The Air Force, of course, played a major significant role in 47-48, landing at Leh, moving troops in the last minute into Kashmir, recovering what we've got now ultimately. And of course, we should have recovered the whole of Kashmir, but I think the ceasefire and taking the case to United Nations was a blunder. We were involved in the Goa liberation in 1961 and 62, of course. Everyone knows what happened in 62. The Air Force was not used other than for logistics support to some extent. And that, I think, once again, is a major, blunder in national decision making. And the Henderson Brooks report is available on the net for everybody to see through that. And he clearly brings it out. The major weakness in 62 was a complete failure of the national decision making at the highest level with respect to the defense. We are still paying for that blunder that we've done in 1962. 65, 71, the Air Force came out with flying colors and they're extremely well. So also in 1999, the story of 1999, on the decision making, I'll cover a little later. Why do I say the IAF is the sword arm is primarily the characteristics that we talk about, which in the last 20 years, while the strength of the aircraft has gone down with the fighter component, but in terms of these capabilities that I've articulated here or mentioned here have come up in a significant way. One is the precision attack capability. You all know about the Balakot strike of last year. And of course, it starts off actually effectively from the Kargil War in 1999. And I was involved in the lightning integration of the weapon system, and the laser guidance weapons did play an important role in bringing a quick end to the Kargil War. Penetration is extremely important. You should be able to penetrate into enemy defenses very effectively. Air powers today is a cat and mouse game. The technologies, rival each other constantly and keep growing constantly. And therefore, the ability to penetrate enemy defenses and reach your target or achieve your objectives is an extremely important area. Reach is extremely important. We tend to forget because we are so focused on Pakistan and China at the borders that the issue of being able to reach into long distances must govern our strategic thinking. Times change. So when we evolved the Tejas as a replacement to Ajit and MiG-21, India was at a different stage. And your strategic thought process were different at that point of time. Today, as a rising power, somebody as a nation who wants to play a major role in global order in decision making with respect to governance of the international order, you need to actually deter adversaries who may threaten your interest anywhere in your areas of interest, and I would say in most parts of the world. And in that context, reach is extremely important. That's where air power comes into play. And we need to focus on that. It's not only in terms of expeditionary capability, which we've already built up significantly well. That is something we are doing quite well. But I think the reach in the context of offensive air power will play a major role in transforming our approach to the way we are now tackling with the Chinese in terms of active defense and aggressive approach. And that is something we need to actually focus on. We only have the Su-30s who can actually measure up to this requirement at this moment. The Rafales will come. They've already come, but they'll take another year and a half to be fully, integrated and play a role, but the numbers need to go up. Rapid response is a characteristic of the Air Force, and that should be exploited. There's no point in having a fabulous Air Force if national decision making is still, I would say hesitant to use the Air Force on these strengths that it has, for the simple fear that air power is inherently escalatory. And that I will prove it that it's completely wrong. Space is an extremely important capability. We are giving importance to it, but I think we need to give much more importance, particularly in the context of ISR, intelligence, and the kind of areas of interest that should be, under surveillance 24/7. When you compare, there is no doubt about, acknowledging the fact that there is a rivalry between India and China, strategically and geopolitically. And therefore, you need to measure up, not one for one, but in terms of certain capabilities, we need to measure up. And that calls for investments and building up certain capabilities much more than what we are doing right now. And space coverage is extremely important. I must also highlight that the Chinese have just operationalized the Beidou, navigation system, which is a 36 satellite constellation. And you would have read already in some of the articles, by end of next year, the Beidou would generate business for the Chinese system to the tune of $1 trillion. And it has a major impact on their, military aspects, particularly when you now link it up with BRA and other issues as well. So let's come to the IAF today. The fighter force, everyone knows we are down to about 32 squadrons now. We need to quickly get back to 42 squadrons, which is our, strength we are looking in the immediate future. The air defense is reasonably fine, but I think you need to actually focus on some of the missile systems to be operationalized as quickly as possible. We are at the moment, we are with Akash and the refurbished Pichoras. It's time the MRSAMs come in a big way and quickly get deployed, plus of course short range as well as longer range missiles. The S-400 will actually add significant teeth to the air defense system. But the S-400 also should come in reasonable numbers. Again, all that calls for a significant investment, capital investment, and that's a tough decision to take. The Air Force have done well in networking. We've started off quite well. We operationalized the Integrated Air Defense Command and Control System, which I must, bring out this aspect. This is something that the Air Force, worked very well. When we started off on this IACCS, there was a lot of pressure for us, particularly from the Israelis, to take the Israeli system and quickly operationalize it. And I think I must give compliment and credit to the former chief, Krishnaswamy, for ensuring that we go the indigenous way and we work with HCL and of course the routers are sister routers, but the complete software control system, everything were evolved by our people. And this is a fairly robust, foolproof AFNet that's come into play. And that is the ground grid, and that's the backbone of the networking system. There are other elements that come into it. The radars have been networked there already. So today you can actually network, you can operate an air defense system from any corner of the country effectively, ideally. And that is what we are aiming to achieve, or the Air Force is aiming to achieve. The other aspect is to, of course, the operational data link, which is taking time. There we've been a little, slow. but I think that will catch up now with the urgency that's already been shown. I was quite involved in this. So when we started off on this initial, laying down the parameters and the requirements, we visited a few countries, and I must say at that time, Air Marshal Varthaman was the air attaché in Paris. We visited a few countries to get our ideas clear and then set down the fundamentals on this. I must say, when we visited Sweden, they are the pioneers of data link. And they displayed the air defense system to us, where the entire peninsula, the Norway-Swedish peninsula, was covered. And that was operational during the Cold War times itself, where two controllers sitting in the air defense control system were actually monitoring the entire country's air defense network. And they could operate, they could work towards launching the air defense aircraft from anywhere in any part of the country. So that's the kind of integrated networking that we're looking at. And this is a good achievement that we've set up. We need to complete that process. And technology, Air Force is technology intensive, and therefore we are looking at the unmanned technologies, unmanned combat vehicles. Communications is a big way. This is we are still waiting for the decisions and to operationalize the software-defined radio communication systems. And this is where I think I've been advising some of the technology companies here, and therefore I think we're moving in. But I must say we've taken a long time here. Both the Army as well as the Air Force. The Army's tactical radio systems is finally moving towards a certain process. But I think there's a lot of urgency that needs to be displayed in bringing these aspects in this technology. One of the, this is a point that I mentioned in my report, and this is where Air Force should take the lead, because Air Force inherently is technology intensive. And I think we are doing well now. I think we've realized that in the context of the Tejas experience, is that to take a lead in driving the technology requirements, so that, the time frames, time escalation and cost escalations are controlled. And we could discuss this in the question answers. Diplomacy is extremely important. And that's something where I think we are doing better now, but it needs to be recognized that the military capability and military strength and military power needs to be interwoven into diplomatic process. It is time we shed our diffidence in the context of, being, defensive about dealing with countries. And China is a classic example. From 93 to now, we've been so worried about having good relations with China that we've actually been, taken for a ride by their process and learn from their experience. The way they built their military power and the way they use the military power in their diplomatic process to coerce countries is something we need to. That is the reality, and that is something we need to learn. And of course, the Indian Air Force will need to be absolutely plugged into the R&D systems and the industry if you really want to achieve Atmanirbhar. We've been talking about this for the last 70 years in terms of self-reliance, in terms of indigenization, in terms of various names. I only wish Atmanirbhar doesn't become another slogan, where we need to do that very carefully. And that's what I'm going to talk about. National power and military instrument, I've already mentioned that intimately, linked. The current situation in Ladakh is something that we need to, which calls for a transformational approach to how we deal with China. We've been defensive in my analysis. Others may, counter that. When I say defensive, I'll explain that when I go on to the next one. The idea that is the use of air power escalatory, that's where the Kargil experience must come. The Army, when it asked for air power, usage, intervention, there was a lot of worries about air power being escalatory and can we, take that risk. We never used air power in any, cases since 1971. And finally, of course, the discussions where the whole points of view were put across to the Prime Minister Vajpayee, and he gave final decision that, go ahead and use the air power, but he put a lot of restrictions, which is not to cross the line of control. Well, now in hindsight, we could actually take different views on that. But fundamentally, I think it was a major decision that we shed our reservations about EPA being escalatory. And Balakot is another watershed moment because we are sending out a message to the adversary that this is what we will do. We won't hesitate to cross the border, both international as well as the LOC, if you now mess with us. And this, we need to sustain this because you've now gone into a particular messaging and this needs to be sustained completely. This is where I now want to bring in the issue with China, dealing with China. Why am I showing this Qing Empire map? A little bit of history would do well for people to understand. The largest empire in Chinese dynasties is the Qing Empire, the Manchus Empire. And what you see shaded here, the Manchus originally is, and I think most of us know that most dynasties were non-Chinese, not the Hans. The Hans ruled for 400 years between 2nd century BC and 2nd century AD, and thereafter different, related groups came in and took over power. They absorbed them, much like we talk about invaders coming in and getting absorbed into India and then becoming, one of us. It was a similar story. The Manchus are actually from here, and they, in the 16th century, with the last Ming emperor, they managed to actually expand, conquer these areas, and then move in here overthrow the Ming kingdom. And this is when anybody talks about China, this is the central China or the core China. And everything else tends to be followed in a system of what is known as the frontier states meant to absorb shocks of invaders, the Mongols from the north, the Turks from the west, and absorb those shocks, and they are stopped there, for which they recognize, their services. And that is the relationship. That is the middle kingdom. For China, this is the central China, or the core China. And everything else tends to be in a system of what is known as the frontier states meant to absorb shocks of invaders, the Mongols from the north, the Turks from the west, and absorb those shocks, and they are stopped there, for which they recognize, their services. That is the relationship. That is the middle kingdom. For China, something's gone wrong here. And everything else tends to be. Rama sir, can you just stop this? I'm recording.
Vignesh, somebody is playing the.
Mongols from the north, the Turks from the west.
He's playing the YouTube simultaneously here.
Yeah, somebody should stop that. Their services. So that's a lag that's showing. That is why it is playing up here. So stop the YouTube or Facebook. Wrong, yeah. And everything else tends to be. Rama sir, can you just stop this from recording?
Vignesh, somebody is playing the.
Yeah, YouTube should be put on silent mode. Yeah, somebody should stop that. So that's a lag that's showing. That is why it is playing up here. Stop the YouTube or Facebook. Wrong, yeah. Can somebody put the YouTube on mute or switch it off?
Somebody is playing the.
Okay, fine. Okay, so when the modern China evolved, they've actually conceived, because Manchu Empire was the largest empire in its history, and therefore when Sun Yat-sen and company actually evolved with the rise of nationalism, they adopted the Westphalian territorial model, and therefore they said all these frontier states, which are pretty much sovereign, should be integrated into the main China, and this is the border. Okay, now Mao Zedong took over through the nationalists out and took over power in 1949. October 1st, he declares PRC, and then by the end of that month, he launches an attack onto Xinjiang. And there were no communication infrastructure completely. So how does he reach there? So Stalin helped him out, a complete airlift of his forces into Xinjiang. And then, he occupies. Why does he do that? He was more afraid of nationalists setting up, collusion with forces here, because they had declared independence long back. Between 1912 and 1949, Tibet had declared independence along with Inner Mongolia and the Turkestan. And they were independent, they were sovereign. And the treaties between India and Tibet is the evidence of all that. So now for him, for nationalist forces could actually derail whatever Mao Zedong had achieved. And therefore, that was the primary reason to integrate and, of course, secure the borders. 1950, he moved into Tibet with the same reasons. And if you remember, between 50 and 54, they launched a lot of attacks into Burma, chasing the nationalists. And then, of course, they settled the Burmese border in 1961, 62, just before war with India. Now, the reasons of, occupying Aksai Chin is that the connecting communication lines were only from Tibet through India. And Aksai Chin was the old ancient, trading route. And that was the only route that was available. Even for forces moving from central China into central Tibet was difficult. And between 50 and 54, they were actually taking help of India. Nehru actually provided, assistance in terms of food and other logistics for the Chinese forces, PLA forces. And this is the tragedy of the whole process. So when we recognized, Tibet as part of China in 1954, that was a blunder because there was nothing in reciprocity. Well, he did not recognize, Zhou Enlai did not recognize the borders. He kept quiet. And then because he needed India's assistance to bring China into Bandung, into the Afro-Asian community. And once they came into that process, then they initiated the problem. 1957, the road was discovered by us. By then, Aksai Chin was, part of it was in their control. And then we, the rest of the history is known. So being the terrain, the army, veterans know the terrain very well. Once an area is captured, it's difficult to dislodge them. Now, what should have been our approach? Our approach should have been, I suppose, anyways, a lot of history is gone, is past. But I think our future approach should be to actually first look at the three lines of contention in terms of LAC. And we stick on to our interpretation of LAC, and our objective should be to push the Chinese onto accepting our area of LAC. And that's where I think our strategy should be not defensive, not having a no man's land between two lines of interpretation, allowing them to move around any way they like. I think we need to enforce the LAC on our terms, and that's where air power comes in. Here, I just want to highlight the famous, formula of measuring how countries perform or how countries evolve their national power. And that's quite straightforward. CEM is, territory, economic, and military. And this is an additive, straightforward. And that is multiplication factors strategy, developing your strategies with national interest. But more important is, how do you follow through that strategy? Your will to follow through that strategy is extremely important. And there needs to be consistency. Your objectives have to be clearly defined. And therefore, that is what we need to actually look at. If you go through game theory analysis, the Chinese have been consistent in their strategy. And we've been defensive. And that is why probably, the salami slicing and creeping strategies, they've been able to succeed so far. And I hope we've actually changed all that. Learning from the adversary, it's important to get back and study the history between 50 and 62, how fabulously they actually worked on their strategies. We changed our approach in 67, 75, and 87 that showed good results. But 93 onwards, I think we've got into a different pattern. And again, we had problems in 2013 in Depsang, and 2017 in Doklam, and now in 2020. China has used territorial disputes to achieve and expand its territories. 23 territorial disputes over the last 70 years. Every one of those territorial claims have been across other countries. And they've finally, settled down between 10% to 50% to 80%. With stronger powers, they haven't given, they've gained more. For example, in the Ussuri River dispute with the Russians, they've gained 80%. But with Burmese, with Nepal, and with countries like, Kazakhstan, they are happy with 10%. This is the strategy that's consistently been played out by them. And out of these 23 disputes, they've used military power in 6. and the one that is continuously sustained without resolving and with no intention of resolving is with India. And that, of course, has a lot of other issues. So employment of air power in this domain, if we now actually in Ladakh use air power, I think we need to understand that's well understood now for a lot of people. What matters is not how big is the Chinese PLA or the PLAF, but what is it that they can bring in the sector. And here, what we can bring in the sector, we have a lot of other advantages in terms of airfield being located much lower or closer to the area of interest. And their airfields that can come into play are at much higher altitudes, too far, not mutually supporting. But more importantly, their strategic priority is not the Indian border, it's more on the eastern coast and the Pacific Ocean. And they can't afford to bring in more power than what they can afford to currently deploy, or maybe a little more. And we will always have a little advantage in local military balance, and that makes a lot of difference considering the terrain and the locations. Second, for the characteristics that I've already described, our ability to play a very forceful role using air power in supporting the army in this terrain will be far more effective. If we had done that in 62, the story would have been different. And therefore, I believe we need to lead with air power in any strategy against the Chinese. That will change the dynamics of the game completely, which means simply enforce the LAC, push the adversary first to our line of LAC, and then subsequently to go on to 7th September 1959 line, call the bluff, negotiate on our terms, and then come to a dispute resolution. Practically, if you ask me, the part of exchange that Zhou Enlai wanted in 1959 is something that I don't think we'll be able to recover. But that is something, the political leadership will have to work subsequently. There is no way we can actually agree to any claims on Tawang or on Arunachal Pradesh. We need to push them out. So to understand the airfields and infrastructure, one of the most important things we need to understand, we built our infrastructure. We have given focus on the border infrastructure. Although very late, at least we've started the work. And this is a fabulous road that we've built. But the Chinese, in the 50 years since their occupation, they built something close to 53,000 kilometers of infrastructure roads. And the next 40 years, between 1950 and 1983, they built 53,000. And now from 83 to now, that 53,000 has gone up to almost 87,000 kilometers. And look at the kind of infrastructure. And now, of course, terrain is favorable to them. They can actually move in forces very rapidly. But of course, despite all that, the airfields will always play a problem with that. Despite technology advances where the aircraft are much more capable, you'll see the airfields are quite far displaced. The only ones that are close are these three. But these two are at 4 kilometers and above, Lhasa and Ziwatse. And this is Neching, if I'm right. Yes, that is very close to our border. That's the only thing that probably can make a difference. But all our airfields, as you see it in this here, they're all, other than Avantipur, Srinagar, and Leh, every one of the other airfields are almost between 100 meters to, between 60 meters to 150 meters elevation. The aircrafts can actually operate very close. They're very close to the borders as well, and they can operate full load, full capabilities. And therefore, we have a significant advantage in the way we can actually bring weight of attack against these people. The strategy is to keep the conflict within the dispute area, not to escalate. The strategy is to throw the onus of escalation onto the Chinese side. And if you do that, then, in a strategic analysis, the Chinese will be loath to escalate into a bigger conflict. They're not interested in a bigger conflict. And this is a mind game. This is probably we will have to actually play that very well. So air power should lead India's military strategy, and the strategy should actually focus on deterrence, coercion, and compellence. And which means if there's a radical approach to how we actually deal with it. Address the current force structure. We need to invest and rapidly build up to 42. Airlift and helilift are reasonably good right now. Attack helicopters are coming. The LCH is coming in from the HAL, production, and we need to accelerate that inputs. ISR and space I mentioned. We need to focus on developing our own weapons. In these areas, the Chinese have left us behind, and therefore our dependency outside will create the kind of problems, both in terms of cost and in terms of time frame. And what should be our 20-year strategy for the Indian Air Force? 42 combat squadrons is an immediate requirement. Tejas Mark 1A, Mark 2, AMCA is the route. Air National Guard, this is a suggestion I had given earlier, and this is, we had an auxiliary Air Force. In 1960s, early 60s, late 50s, sorry, we wound it up, simply for financial reasons. It's time now we follow the American model, get the Air National Guard. 14 squadrons covering all the states. This is the calculation I've made. Produce more Tejas Mark 1A. And this is where, you can't only look at military power only in the context of your weapon systems. Your military power ultimately comes from your industrial capability. And if you now create the Air National Guard, it will actually mean about 250 aircraft, over and above the 106 that Tejas Mark 1A that the Air Force will order. And then, of course, Mark 2 AMCA will be a different case. But having a lot more production addresses two important aspects. One, the Air Force has a very fabulous reserve, both of manpower as well as aircraft. Second, the industry gains through a tremendous amount of experience, absorption of technology, and user feedback. The database increases tremendously. And because of the numbers that are required to be produced, it is imperative that public-private partnerships come into play. And this will also finally address your export capabilities. See the ALH experience, simply because qualities were not at the international level. And therefore, I think this kind of a process addresses national capability immensely, rather than looking at so much of investment on a military capability. It is actually an investment on defense economy and national economy. And that is the way I think it needs to be looked at. And of course, the future is all about unmanned vehicles, UAVs and UCAVs. I think it's time India needs to look at the long-range bomber. How we want to look at it is a different subject by itself. The AMCA design, I've just shown these photographs, it looks pretty much like the F-22. But we must remember, the Tejas took 30 years plus because it was a technology development program. It turned out to be a technology development program because so many new technology, you're using the program to bridge the gap between the technology. And when you start first, it will take that kind of a time. Now, AMCA, if you now move rapidly into very high level of 5th generation technology, one has to be careful. You don't want to take 20 years more on another program. You want it to come out within 10 years to 12 years. Learn from the Chinese model. The first aircraft carrier took 13 years plus, second aircraft carrier took 5 years, and the third aircraft carrier is less than 5 years. This is what we need to look at. And what are the Chinese doing? This is the threat we are going to be looking at. The top one is the J-20. That is the 5th generation fighter already in operation. The lower one is the H-20, the long range stealth bomber. It looks pretty much like B-2. Probably they've stolen the design from there. The prototype's already flying. And this will fly from mainland China, go around Australia and come back. That's the kind of, bomber is necessary to, again, deter and project power. And that's what we need to look at. The nature of war is not about real battle on the ground. It's more about coercion and compellence. And I think we need to bring that process into our strategies very well. IAF should lead the national military strategy and diplomacy. Our ability to project power is vital, and therefore capability should be strategized well so that it is rooted in Indian industry. And how should Indian Air Force look at 2032? I think it should factor all these issues that I've indicated. And finally, let me end by quoting Vegetius, a Roman general, almost 2000 years ago. And that's very valid. If you desire peace, be prepared for war. That's the only way you can deter an adversary looking for adventures or trying to sit on our head and coerce us. And this is very extremely important. Thank you very much. If there are questions, I'll take them.
Gentlemen, if you have questions, please, you can either raise your hand or straight away ask. VN Mani, that you go ahead and ask.
Good evening, Marshal. I had a suggestion here, like what you had already mentioned about the National Air Guard. So the army could, in the form of Rashtriya Rifles, did have a secondary sort of army for itself. And they already had this model in terms of Assam Rifles functioning under the Central Police Forces. So I think it is only in terms of the investment that one needs to do in terms of aircrafts. Men are always available, I suppose, with the Army, Navy, or the Air Force. We have the Coast Guard too, but in terms of the Air Force only, I think it's lacking. And I think your point is very valid. And how far are we from raising a National Air Guard that which you've been able to, you have told us right now?
I don't think that's been considered at all. Firstly, when you spoke about territorial army and of course the paramilitary force is a different case, and I believe it is almost impossible that the government will agree to it. But the paramilitary forces need to come under the army's control, or it has to have a absolute linkage to the army. That's one issue. Similarly, the Air National Guard, when it's created, has to be under the Air Force and the Ministry of Defense. Coast Guard is under the Ministry of Defense. The point I'm bringing about is anytime you talk about an auxiliary Air Force or an Air National Guard, the government already is balking at the level of investment and capital investment that will be required. And therefore, they look at it purely from a financial angle. And they tend to delay or not even discuss that issue. We need to look at it from a national, capability buildup. We need more people to participate in the military service. And Air National Guard will provide that kind of an issue. And now, if you now link it up into the format in which the local defenses and the territorial defenses and the coastal defenses are involved, it can be very well done. And like I said, ultimately it has fabulous returns in terms of HR, human resources, and Air National Guard will provide that kind of an issue. And now, and of course, into the format in which somebody is playing the user.
The YouTube is flashing with it. What is it?
And of course, in terms of defense, national economy and defense economy. That's what.
Thanks, Marshal.
Welcome.
Please.
Good evening, sir. I am Dhanesh here. I have few questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
First, what is the status on the Su-57? Like we have a collaboration with the Russians. So any
The government
status
has
right
already
now?
announced and the Air Force also made that statement a few years back that they've dropped the collaboration because the cost is unaffordable. That's one. And the Su-57, although it's now already operational, I think that's behind us now. Unless, between countries, relationships can revive various things. And I've seen that happening earlier. But right now, I think as things stand, the Su-57 is behind us.
Sir, and one more question. Will the AMCA have the energy weapons like the laser weapon and the kiloampere linear projectile weapons? Is it possible?
Research will be there, but I doubt if that will materialize within that time frame. That is one. But in terms of laser sensors, that will all be there. That's a mature technology already. That will all be there. The energy weapons is all over the world. It's still, I don't think even the US has any operationalized energy weapons, although considerable amount of experiments have been done and a lot of things have been proven. But I suppose in fielding it as a military weapon system, I think there is still a lot of gap there. I mean, at least on open sources that we see.
Yes. So can you explain about the DRDO Ghatak? Can you just elaborate it
I'm not
a
aware of.
little more?
I'm sorry. Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
thank you, sir.
Colonel Saina, there is some question. Is raise the hand and please. Ian Saina, they can see you. Raise the hand. Your question, please.
What are you people talking? Are you guys calling your something doesn't seem to be. Well, it seems to reason that there's more than this.
You please. No. Saina, what is your question? You raise the hand. You're muted. Please unmute yourself. That is why your voice is not being heard. You got to unmute yourself.
You have to unmute yourself, sir.
You have to unmute yourself. We cannot hear you.
At the bottom left, there is a mic.
Sir,
Yeah.
I can hear you now.
Yeah, now you can hear. Come on, please. Raise the hand. Speak on, please.
hello.
Yeah,
Yes,
yes,
go on.
yes.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah, yes, yes.
Sir, my question is, when you projected the airfields of PLA Air Force, the threat emanating from Kunming area, that is Yunnan provinces, is ignored. Number one. Number two, the MIC, the military industrial complex of our country, has to be considered. If the Air Force is to be considered as a power, because our MIC is not, I don't think it is, what is that, supportive to the Indian Air Force, number one. Number two, the Indian Air Force should have our component, that is, we call in terms of BRDs or whatever it is, they should be equally competent and produce aircraft and components, and for which we should have the various small industries supporting that, which is not there. So what I require, what I would suggest is we should carry out a proper SWOT analysis of both India and China before we recognize Indian Air Force as some kind of power wherein we can corner China in the future.
No, I think first is we're not cornering China in the future. Okay, let me put it this way. We are defending ourselves and we are defending our interests. So yes, they can attack from Yunnan, but they will have to fly through Burma. They will have to violate Burmese airspace. They can do that, being a great power when they want to do it. That's one. But, you know, in any conflict, that is why I told you, put the onus of escalation on him, being prepared for a certain level of escalation. So the idea of, you know, taking on an active defense strategy is to limit your engagements within your zone of conflict, which is all about around the LAC, the areas of dispute. The moment you cross your borders, each one attacking each other's vital assets, the escalation has gone through the roof. There is no limit to it. And being two nuclear weapon states and recognized as, you know, major powers and very responsible nuclear weapons, your engagements within your zone of, again, somebody is putting on the YouTube, all about around the LAC.
Please don't play the YouTube. It's going on.
The moment you cross your borders, each one attacking each other.
Vignesh, what to do about this? Somebody is playing the YouTube in between.
No limit. And being two nuclear weapon states and recognized as, you know, major powers and very
Switch that off, Vignesh.
engagements within your zone of, again, somebody is putting on.
I think it is General Chandar Govind Swami.
Please put it off. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I think my train of thought is, okay, fine. So, you know, as responsible nuclear weapon states and great powers in the international system, you expect these nations to get into dialogue and get into control situation. So that kind of an escalation is very difficult to visualize or difficult to, you know, look at. While, you know, announcements and threatening, you know, statements could be made, on the ground, it depends how we behave and how they respond to it. And if you put the onus of escalation on them, they need to behave as well, because it is also about what they're aspiring to be in the international system. They want to be the leaders in the apex position. So they cannot be Rambo in this entire process. Second is, of course, in terms of local area defense, in terms of local military balance of power, we can get into a lot more discussion on that. But I would recommend, there is a nice study done in Harvard and Naval War College quite recently, and that I think is quite logical. We can put up forces. Of course, again, it all depends on the level of escalation. Once beyond a certain point, then it's a full-fledged war. Then you're also getting very close to the nuclear, nuclear battle, and it's not going to work. That's too dangerous for both sides. It doesn't matter whether he has 1,000 weapons or 500 weapons, and whether we have 100 nuclear weapons. It doesn't matter. Nuclear deterrence is a different ball game altogether. On the industry, yes, we are. There is a lot of difference. We don't have to do a SWOT analysis anymore. We know where the Chinese are, and their products speak for themselves. We have inherent structural weaknesses in our system. There are any number of reports that have actually analyzed that, and I think that needs to be done. It's a complex issue. It's a political, bureaucratic, issue we don't want to recognize, and there is also a turf war. Individual empires that actually play a role in that. I would also blame the Indian industry because they're not. They want a very safe, guaranteed orders from the Indian military, and they're not very open to getting into the export market. Unlike any other consumer product, any other industry, the defense industry is a ruthless industry, which is very difficult to break into somebody else's domain, which is dominated by the Western countries. And if you want to break into it, you have to break into it through quality and very, very cost competitiveness. So if you're going to price the Tejas at $65 million, nobody's going to come to you. Let me tell you that. Okay, if somebody is giving a JF-17 at $30 million or $25 million, then he will look at that. Okay, so there are many factors that are involved in this, and we need to recognize that issue and call spade a spade, and then rework our strategy on this. It's a challenge.
Any more questions? In which case, thank you very much, Marshal. That was a very enlightening talk. So,
go ahead.
Thank you. I mean, we'll look forward to another one in a few months again, like we keep troubling you. Thank you very much, everybody. Vignesh, can we have the national anthem, please?
Yes, sir. Amana.
Thank you all.
Right, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Wonderful talk, Matesh. Great talk. Very enlightening.
Thank you, Rajavelu. Good to see you here. Okay.